and hopefully we all will learn a lot today. Professor Meenakshi, the stage is all yours now.
Great. Thank you, Tirtha. I appreciate that. And I also want to reiterate that please feel free to interrupt me and ask me something. And also to say that if you prefer to put something on the chat window, I'll request the moderators to let me know, because for some reason, when I'm in presentation mode, I'm unable to see the chat window. So with those preliminaries, let me start, and thank you for inviting me. CDS has always had a special place in my heart, and nothing gives me more pleasure than to interact with students and faculty there in some form or the other, even if it is online. So I want to talk a little bit about why we are working on this. This is, as I had noted on the lead slide, this is based in part, not entirely, but in part on some joint work that I have done with Professor K.L. Krishna recently. And so to contextualize why we're looking at this, the idea is simply that even before the pandemic hit, and I don't have actually, I have maybe one slide on the pandemic, but even before so-called normal times, there was concerns over inclusive growth. And one of the ways, one of the metrics that you assess inclusive growth by is to look at how structural transformation of the economy has occurred. By structural transformation, I mean it in a very Lewisian two-sector model kind of sense, where with economic development, the agricultural sector is a reserve of surplus labor and is of low productivity. And there is another sector, which is the urban sector, often just equated with industry or manufacturing, which is high productivity, a high productivity sector. And so the agricultural sector is both a source of food and potentially a source of surplus labor. This is sort of the 1950s formulation of dual sector economies. And with transformation, the agriculture labor was sort of pulled into industry or manufacturing, and they would then in turn induce productivity growth in the agricultural sector, improving agricultural productivity. And with agricultural productivity, you would also have higher wages. And so you would have sort of a convergence between the wages earned by the agricultural and manufacturing sectors, and the share of the dependence on agriculture would decline, both in terms of output as well as in terms of employment, as they get pulled into the most productive sectors of the economy. So this is sort of the starting point for our analysis, and we want to really look at, well, how has that happened? And in contrast to much of the literature on structural transformation, our focus is really on the rural economy itself. In other words, we don't equate, while agriculture is largely rural, rural does not imply only agriculture, because the rural sector is also home to a lot of non-agricultural subsectors as well. So, and I'll go on to talk a little bit about the implications for the trends in agricultural productivity, the trends in prices and farm business incomes, and then I'll kind of end up with discussing how all this ties together, given we're looking ahead. We have a depleting resource base, particularly of groundwater, and the scenarios of climate change. Now, this is a fairly wide canvas. And
Professor Meenakshi, someone requested, is there some, can you hide, click hide on the pop-up bar? I think students are not able to see some bullets. Is there something like that on your screen?
Yes,
hide.
yes, there is. Yeah. Is this better now?
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, please continue.
And is the, I'm also audible. Is that
yes.
Okay. Fine. So, as I said, I have a fairly ambitious agenda to cover in the next hour and 15 minutes, because I really would like to leave a time for discussion. So I'm going to just summarize what I plan to say. So you will say, well, where's the evidence? No, there's no evidence yet. I'm just giving you a roadmap of what I'm going to say, and then get into the details of it. So the first point is about structural transformation. The point is that there is a substantial structural transformation that's happening within the rural economy that is independent of what is happening in the urban sector. And yet, while this shows up in terms of shares of net domestic product, it does not actually translate into a narrowing of the gap between the share of agriculture and value added, or NDP, and that in rural employment. And again, one feature which distinguishes our work is that we also look at women's employment separately in a very aggregate sense. There's also diversification within the agricultural sector in terms of the share that is contributed by livestock and horticulture. These are all high value subsectors within agriculture. And while these are the major sources of growth in output, the cereal sector, namely rice and wheat, tend to be the predominant source of livelihoods in the economy, not just within agriculture. And as I said earlier, this has to be seen in the context of increasing land fragmentation and depleting water resources. So to the extent that productivity growth is sort of a key component to understanding sustainability of agriculture, we first look at total factor productivity growth in agriculture at the aggregate level, where we show that it accounted for the predominant share of growth in the last decades, which is a good thing. And at the farmer level, the probability distribution of a probability density function of total factor productivity has also shifted to the right, but there is regional and crop specificity. And of course, TFP growth cannot be equated to technological change because of rainfall dependence, a lot of omitted variables, and the changing composition of growth. And some of this TFP growth actually is explained by the fact that labor, especially in recent years, appears to be exiting agriculture. So to the extent that TFP is a residual, the TFP is picking up the fact that that productivity growth is happening despite the exit of labor from agriculture. I will then turn to questions on price formation and price policy, where I'll try and outline a framework by which we can understand how market reforms are supposed to work that have been under so much debate. I don't have a lot of empirical evidence to cite on whether market reforms are working or not. I'll give you two examples of this, but not an exhaustive evidence base on this. So the analysis of the market reforms is going to be more conceptual than empirical. That's the emphasis. I'll then go on to talk about the role of the minimum support price in theory and in practice, and then try and tie these two together, in other words, productivity growth and prices, into seeing what's happening with farm business incomes in paddy and wheat, both at the all India level and for selected states. And then I'll turn finally to the challenges of a depleting water resources to see whether volumetric pricing might help and what will happen in climate change. I'm not going to have a lot to say on climate change, primarily because I know Professor Kavi Kumar is going to be talking to you later this afternoon, and certainly he is one of the primary experts in this area. So let me plunge into the evidence, which is to look at structural transformation of the rural economy by looking at the rural share. This is of net domestic product. So if you look at the rural share of total net domestic product, then the rural share has been declining, but it's declined from 62 to 50%. So over a 40-year period, that is not perhaps a dramatic decline, but nonetheless a decline of about 14 percentage points over 40-year period. But if you look at the agriculture share of rural net domestic product, then that has actually declined much faster. In other words, where agriculture's share in net domestic product in rural areas was almost 3/4, 72%, it's less than a half. It's only about 39% in 2011-12 and has likely declined further. You may be asking, why don't you have data up to more recent times? The reason is that these rural-urban breakup is only available in the years in which the statistical office undertakes a base revision. So the last base revision was done in 2011-12. So my data set also stops at 2011-12. So in terms of rural net domestic product, actually, even within rural areas, agriculture is only about 40%. And non-farm, the manufacturing, call it manufacturing services, whatever, that's now 61% of the net domestic product in rural areas. So again, I just want to emphasize that while it's certainly okay to say agriculture is predominantly rural, it's not okay to say that rural implies agriculture, because the two are certainly not equivalent. And even within the rural areas, there has been a substantial transformation. And this is indeed what you would expect with development, that the dependence on agriculture will gradually decline. Now let's turn to the second part of the story, which is what's happening to employment shares. So this is again, this should have said employment, not the gap in NDP employment share. So that the title is a typo. Apologies for that. So if you look at the agriculture share in employment of men and women in rural areas, again our focus is rural areas, then you'll see that yes, there has been a decline in the reliance on agriculture from about 80% in 1983 down to about 56% in 2011-12. But while this decline is seen also for women in terms of their reliance on agriculture, the decline is not as sharp. In other words, if you think of this as a nearly 20 percentage point decrease, for women, it's barely a 10 percentage point decrease. So to the extent that women are working, they tend to continue to rely on agriculture to a far greater extent than do the men. So the structural transformation in terms of employment is happening far more slowly than in its share in output, and more so more so for men, more so for women than for men. I should, however, note, of course, that workforce participation rates for women in general are, of course, much lower than they are for men. So these trends should be interpreted in that context. So if we now look at the latest year on rural NDP and then match it up for the latest corresponding year for employment, and take the difference between the NDP share and the employment share, which is an indicator of whether there is some convergence, because that's a way of looking at, well, is the growth in income being matched, or rather the decline in income being matched by the decline in reliance in terms of employment, you'll find that there is in fact a substantial gap. It perhaps even is increasing for men and for women, although maybe in the last 5-10 years ending in 2011-12, this trend may have reversed somewhat for women. So there is yet no, so while there has been structural transformation in terms of improving livelihoods of people, there seems to be a huge lag. And in this respect, I mean, there's a lot of literature, of course, of looking at similar kinds of questions in for India as a whole. The Indian experience lies in sharp contrast with that of other Asian countries in general, in that the so-called Lewisian turning point, where more people start to get employed in the non-agricultural sector relative to the agricultural sector, and that's accompanied by higher rates of urbanization, et cetera, that Lewisian turning point has happened or will happen much sooner for the other Asian economies relative to India, and that does not include China, because China is a whole different pattern of development. Now, the paradox then is that if we look at the rate of growth in agricultural output and farm incomes, let me start with the last column and then move back, which is if we look at the rate of growth, simple percent per year average log changes, then agricultural output has increased by about 4% per year. This is not value added, this is just output. And that's a fairly healthy rate of growth. It's certainly higher than the rate of growth of population. But if you look at what has happened to farm or farmer incomes in paddy and wheat, you will see that the last decade and a half, the last 15 years or so that this data represent, have actually seen incomes decrease. And this is a little bit of a puzzle, because if output is increasing, why aren't incomes also increasing? And why, if anything, do they show a declining trend in income? Now, I want to have a caveat that, of course, this is all of agricultural output, and this is only paddy and wheat. But as I will mention, these are sort of the predominant sources of livelihoods for cultivators in rural India. These seem to be showing a negative trend. Now, in the previous years, you don't necessarily see a one-to-one mapping. For instance, if you look at the period of the early 80s, when the gains from the Green Revolution technology were starting to get more geographically widespread, you had agricultural output grow at about 1.5%, but farm incomes were actually growing at a fairly healthy rate. But at any rate, all of these were in some sense in the same direction, that you had agricultural output growth and you had incomes also increasing at 4%, 1%, 1.5%, whatever it is. It's only in the last 15 years or so that you see this completely different switch in terms of the trends in agricultural output and in farmer or farm incomes. And it's really this discrepancy that motivated us to look at what might be going on. So there are two pieces to this. One is the agricultural productivity piece and one is the prices piece. And I want to now take each of these up in turn. But before I do so, maybe I could pause and see if there are any questions on what I have said so far. Anything on the chat? Okay. Right. So since this is also sort of addressing postgraduate students and PhD students, I'll take a slight methodological detour once in a while. In this case, I'm just going to talk about what we mean by total factor productivity growth, and the growth aspect, the growth word is important. And total factor productivity is really just a change in output minus a weighted average of changes in input. So there are various inputs. You aggregate over those change in those inputs, and there are weights that are used. Typically, cost shares are used for this, and this is very useful to use in these aggregate kind of studies because you're able to get comparable data across countries, for example. So you can compare agricultural productivity growth in India with China, with Indonesia, with Malaysia, whatever. So put very simply, TFP growth, so it's a growth, is that part of the change in output that can't be explained by changes in inputs. And this total factor productivity growth in turn consists of at least two and more than two components. To the extent that it's a residual, it is capturing all the inputs that you could not find data on or which are intrinsically unobserved, like the skill of the farmer and so on and so forth. That's also an input that you can't observe in these aggregate data. So the TFP growth is picking up those any unobserved input as well as omitted input. So if you didn't include fertilizer as one of the inputs, then whatever part of the increase in output that would have been explained by increase in fertilizer is going to get captured in the residual, which is what we are calling total factor productivity growth. And I'll come back to this later. But also important to note that this total factor productivity growth is a combination of technical change, in other words, a shift in the production function, as well as technical efficiency, which is that farmers who are operating well below a production possibilities frontier are starting to move closer to what is possible given levels of inputs. I won't have anything to say about this technical efficiency versus technological change decomposition, except to point you to references that kind of disaggregate this. Right now, we're just going to focus on total factor productivity growth. So what I have done is to look at those are the same numbers on rate of growth in agricultural output over these various sub-periods. And you can be asking, well, how did you come up with these sub-periods? These sub-periods have been used in the literature now for several years. This was a periodization that was done first in an EPW paper by Ramesh Chand and his co-author. where they use an endogenously determined structural break to say, well, in terms of agriculture, how does the growth pattern manifest in terms of various sub-periods where you think that there's in fact been a structural change in the pattern of growth. So these are endogenously determined sub-periods. And so many people, including us, continue to use this characterization. So they characterize, for instance, the period of the early 80s as a period of widespread technology diffusion. The mid 90s to 2000s is the post reform period. There is mid to late 2000, which is called the recovery period, although you wouldn't say why is there a recovery, because these two are fairly similar, but there are other rates of growth that indicate that this is in fact a period of reforms. The post-reform period actually led to a substantial period of recovery, etc., etc. Okay, so these are the rates of growth. Now, this residual disaggregation, what we've done is just to look at the percent contribution of each of these inputs in this output growth rate. In these output growth rates. So in other words, if I look at the inputs, I'm just focusing on the labor component here. There are the other inputs which we are using. This is from the CLEMS database, which is also an international database. And so whatever is left is attributed to TFP share. So what I'm trying to say is that the sum of these three rows will always add up to 100. So let's take a look at the period of widespread technology diffusion. This period was actually much of the growth came from the increased use of other inputs as well as increased use of labor. So together, these account for more than 90% of the growth in agricultural output in the early 80s was accounted for by increased use of inputs, and only 7% to technical change or technical efficiency was the contribution was only 7%. So all of these three rows will always add up to 100. Now, over time, you'll see a decrease in the share of labor in explaining agricultural output growth. Okay, and in fact, what you'll find is that post mid 2000s or so, in the last 15 years or so, the labor share has become actually negative. In other words, labor, in fact, is exiting agriculture, and therefore the contribution, obviously, to agricultural output growth, since labor is a normal input, will be negative. So, as a consequence, what you'll find, for instance, in the mid to late 2000s, is that all of the output growth in up to 2.29% per year is attributed to the use of inputs like energy, materials, services, etc., etc. It's actually more than 100% of this is getting accounted for. All of this growth is getting accounted for by these other inputs, and only 3% is the total factor productivity share. Okay. Now look what happens in the late 2000s to the present decade is that almost 60%, so 60% is the contribution of other inputs. Labor continues to be negative, and I think if you project this out further, that will continue to be the case. It is 60% is of other inputs, and therefore, because this has to add up to 100, you'll find that the TFP share is 58%. In other words, the way that this is getting calculated is that you add up the labor share and that of all the other inputs that have gone into this XI, and subtract it from 100, and that will give you the TFP share in this 1.54% rate of growth per annum. So of this 4% rate of growth, 3.86% rate of growth in the recent period, which we've said is a healthy rate of growth, 60% of it has come from other inputs. Labor has exited, so it cuts that down by 18%, and as a consequence, you would conclude from looking at this the total factor productivity, which is the kind of you want the TFP share to be high, because in some sense it represents the technical change that's happening within the agriculture sector. So it's almost equal. The contribution of TFP is almost equal to that of other inputs in explaining growth in the most recent period. And again, you would sort of say, well, this is good. Okay, maybe it's not 58%, maybe it's actually just 40%. If I were to say, discount this and make that zero, nonetheless, it's actually a good thing because it's saying that technology is contributing, has started to contribute again to the rate of growth in agriculture, and agriculture is no longer dependent so much on increased inputs to actually affect increased output. Let me again pause there and see if there are any questions.
Hello, ma'am. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, so as you can see that the labor share is falling drastically. So what is the reason? What is the possible reason for this?
Labor is exiting agriculture. This is right now just a decomposition exercise.
Yeah, so this is this because they are diverting their livelihood towards the non-farm sector?
So whether they're, yeah, I mean, that's a definitional point, or they're withdrawing from the labor force entirely. I don't have the numbers to tell you how much of that decrease in agriculture has gone to non-farm sectors and how much of it, especially in the case of women, has been to pull out of the labor force entirely.
Okay.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Hello, ma'am.
Actually explain the re-emergence in the increasing share of TFP. Are we seeing mechanization or this sort of things in agriculture?
So remember that if you have mechanization, it should come under other inputs in principle.
Okay. Then what potentially shows this re-emergence in the late 2000s and present?
So I'll have something to say about this in a little while, and I'd request you to just hold off on that. And if I haven't answered, and I think it's a mechanical answer actually, but I think I'll answer it in the next few slides, and I'd request you to just wait until then. And if I still don't answer, then tell me again.
Okay, sure.
This is just a residual method. So what is the rate of growth in output? How much was the increase in inputs? Get a weighted average of those inputs. So the difference must be at the aggregate level. The difference therefore must be total factor productivity growth. It's a residual. It's called a growth accounting framework. There's no econometrics here. It's simply an accounting. It's simply an accounting exercise. There we go. Now your answer. So the first sort of explanation, so although by way of discrepancy, I am referring much more to the fact that you're seeing rates of growth that are reasonable, especially in the recent years of value of agricultural output, but you're not seeing this translate into farmer incomes at least for paddy and wheat. So, and this will also indirectly answer the question I think that was just raised. Where is that 58% coming from? I don't have a definitive answer, but I can certainly tell you, and I'll tell you why I can't have a definitive answer, but I'll at least tell you what seems to be plausible. The first is that agricultural output itself is changing towards more high value crops, and that's certainly happening. And the other thing that can be happening is that within the agricultural sector, some sectors have really improved their productivity and some sectors haven't. So for example, if it turns out that the wheat and paddy sectors are not seeing improvements in productivity, then it's not very surprising to see that the farmer incomes from the wheat and rice sectors is declining, and instead, let's say that the productivity of the dairy sector has taken off, or the productivity of the poultry sector has taken off. All these are getting clubbed into the agricultural output aggregate. So it's entirely conceivable that there are differential trends in productivity across subsectors, and that in turn could explain. So both in terms of what's happening, if you like, on the input side and crop specific productivity, as well as in terms of just, what is the valuation, because remember, this is output as measured in rupees crores. So that can happen where a very small sector actually accounts for a very large, it's extremely high value, and so accounts for a very large proportion of of agricultural output. And while I won't do it in terms of agricultural output, I want to show this to you in terms of gross value added, because at least the focus then is on the primary inputs of capital and labor. So this is gross value added in agriculture, and the National Account Statistics will give you a subsectoral classification into crops, into livestock, and into forestry and fisheries. So livestock will also include the dairy sector. So of course, agricultural sector has been growing, and so it's this latter period is about the 4% rate of growth in output, not in value added. In fact, in value added, I think it's about this rate of growth is about 6% for the aggregate. So it's not as if the crop sector hasn't been growing. The crop sector has also been growing. Obviously, these are real 2011-12 rupees. But what you'll notice is that the share of the livestock sector has been steadily increasing over time. Okay? And similarly, forestry and fisheries is also showing an increasing trend, especially in the last 10 years, last 10, 12 years or so. So that's the first point to take away. The second point, which is not actually reflected in this graph, but I think I have a slide on this, is that within the crop sector, it's the horticulture crops, the vegetables and the fruits that are accounting for a much larger share of value added. So this is value added and non-gross output of value added within the crop sector. So if you look at across the primary subsectors for which we have national accounts, you'll see that all are increasing, but the rate of increase in livestock and forestry and fisheries is sort of starting to take over. So at this point, about 2/3 of the value added is coming from the crop sector, and 1/3 is coming from the non-crop sector within agriculture. And of course, you don't need me to tell you that the livestock and forestry and fisheries are basically high value crops. So what you're getting on the left hand side is, let's say, a much higher share in gross output of these high value crops. And even if therefore there is no change in the rate of growth in inputs, you'll see an increase in total factor productivity, that 58%, mainly because, or at least in part because the value of output has changed towards more productive sectors of the economy. Having said that, it's important to recognize that the crop sector is still the largest within agriculture. It's about 60%, not 2/3, 60% of value added. And within crops, cereals accounted for nearly 40%. So in other words, 60% of the value added in crops is from non-cereals. So wheat and rice, jawar, bajra, these are all cereals. And the pulses, the oil seeds, the horticulture, vegetables, all of that comes in the 60% within the crop sector. So why are we then still focused on cereals? Indeed, there is now a lot of literature that says that all our policies are too focused on rice and wheat, because if you look at some of these statistics, you would say that, look, the agricultural sector has really transformed and out of its dependence on wheat and rice, so policies need to make that switch as well. I want to caution against it. I think there is merit in that argument. However, I do want to note that to the extent that we are also looking at growth with where the shares of benefit from growth is actually shared equitably, and so to the extent therefore that our focus is on livelihoods, cultivation, namely crops, accounts for 63% of non-wage incomes of agricultural households, whereas the share of livestock is only about 25%. Also, food grains account for 63% of gross cropped area, and the area under fruits and vegetables, which accounts, so it's in there in this non-40%, in other words, within the 60%, it's almost 20% of the value added from crops, but it only accounts for 5% of the area under cultivation. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that, yes, while in terms of output, the composition of output has changed dramatically over time, if we look at livelihoods, they still continue to be largely dependent on the cultivation of crops, and in particular on the cultivation of cereals. Now, all of these are changing. This is not a static statement. This is also starting to happen. The declining dependence on cereals is also starting to happen. However, at this sort of snapshot in time, if I look at what is the predominant source of livelihoods, because that's what I'm interested in as a welfare metric, then that tends to be dominated by cereals and also by wheat and rice in terms of being the single largest subsector. Does that answer your question? That you had? This is still only a part answer. I haven't given you a complete answer, but at least as a preliminary answer, does that make sense?
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. So why don't we now look at, instead of looking at aggregate productivity, why don't we now look at farmer-specific productivity and see whether there, it's in fact the case that maybe wheat and rice are not seeing the kind of productivity changes that you would expect. Now, doing an analysis at a growth accounting sense is of course possible. But what we wanted to do is to look at the entire distribution of total factor productivity. In other words, look at how farmer-specific total factor productivity may be changing over time. In order to do this, this is the standard Cobb-Douglas production function, written in logarithmic terms. So this is in fact a multiplicative error term, but since we're taking logs, it linearizes this. And so what we do basically is, now there's an error term. So this residual is in a sense, for that farmer, the part of the output that couldn't be explained by inputs, right? So there's a direct parallel in terms of how we think of total factor productivity. When we were talking about aggregate total factor productivity, we were talking about growth so total factor productivity was that part of the growth in output that couldn't be explained by the weighted average of growth in inputs. So this is not a very satisfactory thing to do, because if I were to estimate this, then this is just, for example, if I were to do it with OLS, I wouldn't do it with OLS, but supposing we were to do it with OLS, then you would say that, well, the residuals sum to 0. So how does that help me at all? So what the literature has done is to say, let me define myself a reference farmer. And typically the reference farmer, let's say I'm doing this over time, starting from time period 1 to time period, 10. Then I look at a reference farmer in time period 1, and the reference farmer can be basically a person who's an average farmer. Now there's slight nuance here, because again, we know that estimated residual sum to 0. So we try and evaluate this average farmer in terms of geometric means. And then, so in year 1, this is the average farmer. That is, in a sense, the part of productivity that couldn't be explained for that farmer's use of inputs. Then every other farmer, so I here indexes a farmer, every other farmer's productivity, relative productivity, is measured in terms of the difference between the productivity of the ith farmer, residual productivity of the ith farmer, and the residual productivity of the reference farmer. So in other words, some farmers are more productive than this average farmer, some farmers are less productive in relative to this reference farmer. So this is the same kind of a setup, except now we are putting a functional form here, namely a Cobb-Douglas, and we estimate this acknowledging the fact that this is going to be endogenous. These inputs are going to be endogenous. So I don't need to get into details of that, except to note that we are using the panel structure of the cost of cultivation surveys, and these are freely downloadable from the Ministry of Agriculture's website. And we compute this in using 2 rounds of the panel data. It's a rotating panel in the cost of cultivation data. So I now have the relative TFP of every farmer in the, let's say, the 2 time periods that I'm looking at. And so I can plot a distribution or a density, an empirical probability density function of the relative TFP in time period 1. I'm going to stay with the reference farmer of time period 1 and similarly plot the density of the estimated relative TFP in time period 2 to see whether there is actually a narrowing of productivity differentials across farmers, and B, to see if there is a shift in the estimated TFP, and if there is a rightward shift, you would say, well, yes, there has been total factor productivity growth over time, and if there is no change, in other words, the two sort of distributions sit on top of each other, you'll say that there hasn't been that much change. Is the idea of what I'm trying to do, is that clear, or are there any questions about how I've switched from looking at total factor productivity growth down to looking at relative total factor productivity? Are there any questions about that?
I have a question. Will that be okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're measuring the average, you say you're measuring the geometric mean, right? To identify the average farmer. So that would be what? All India, state-wise, crop specific?
No, it's state and crop specific.
State and so for wheat, say in Punjab, there would be a different average, and Haryana wheat would be different average.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
So we have a sample of about 300 farmers in most states. In UP, it's about 400 farmers. So it's crop specific. So you compute the geometric means of the inputs and outputs for the sample in my case 2008 to 2010, the geometric mean in 2008 for the inputs and for the output for paddy in UP, for paddy in West Bengal, etc., etc.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions on what this is trying to do? Right. So if you look at, so this is the blue line is the this estimated relative TFP for paddy in UP in 2008-10. And what you can see is indeed the distribution has shifted to the right. The fact that it has shifted to the right means that in fact there has been change in the distribution of TFP over time. At this point, I don't want to focus on whether the variances are getting pinched or not. Similarly, in paddy in West Bengal, you see a rightward shift in the densities of TFP. In other words, over this approximately 7-year period, there has in fact been improvement in total factor productivity as measured so far. Similarly, in wheat in Uttar Pradesh, this blue line is everywhere to the left of, in other words, the red line first order stochastically dominates this blue line, blue distribution. And so there has been TFP change over time in relative TFP. But now look at wheat in Madhya Pradesh, where you in fact see that the 2014-16 distribution is to the left of the 2008-10 distribution. And I'm writing 2008-10 because these are crop years and these are 3-year panels that we get from the CSCP. So the answer to whether productivity in wheat and rice has come down over time, this is not a complete answer, but this is enough of an answer to say that there is improvement in some states, but you cannot rule out that there may in fact be declining productivity in some crops and states. So maybe if I had looked at another state for paddy, I might have seen this, but this is as much as we decided to work on given the time that we had to finish this paper. Okay. So it's an ambiguous story, but it's certainly not the case. At least we can say it's not the case that there has been a declining productivity in total factor productivity in wheat and rice, because we are at least seeing in some major producing states in West Bengal and UP for paddy and Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh for wheat, that this is not true in 3 out of the 4 cases. Okay. So I want to now go back and talk about, is this an indicator of technical change, because you're picking it all up from the residual. The first point I've already made, which is that there is a change in composition of output, but that's happening on a relative row base. So those rates of growth are really, are really very high because there's a low base on which we're starting. But the more critical thing is the fact that to what extent have I captured all the inputs that have gone into the output? And a big part of the missing sort of inputs, there are many, such as managerial skills, such as embodied technical change in seeds, etc. All the seeds is there as an input. The main concern is around water or irrigation. So we have two different data sources that we use, although I've only shown you one data set. So while we have some information on whether the land is irrigated or not, it winds up being a poor proxy for irrigation, because it doesn't tell you anything about the volume of water that is used in cultivation. And as a simple exercise, because we can't produce data on volumes when none exists, as a simple exercise, what we decided to do is to say, well, let's look at, we know that agriculture is still rainfall dependent. So why don't we just regress total factor productivity growth and regress it on the changes in the southwest monsoon? Okay. And we'll find, and just look at the R square. So this 40% here is saying that variations in rainfall account for nearly 40% of the variation in TFP growth. Okay. So in other words, in periods when there is better rainfall, above average rainfall, in those sub periods that I was talking about, in the periods where there is above average rainfall, the TFP number is going to be overstated because it's picking up the effect of the rainfall. In periods when there is below average rainfall or a declining trend in rainfall, then whatever that TFP figure is actually underestimated, because TFP may well have been higher had there been normal rainfall. And this matters especially when you're looking at relatively small time periods, because we know that rainfall is supposed to be random and have mean zero, etc., etc. Climate change, of course, has changed all that understanding. But normal rainfall is also in some sense defined over what is normal for a particular state and region over a 100-year period. So the takeaway so far is that there's substantial, so TFP growth, take those numbers with a pinch of salt, because there are omitted variables, and the most significant of those that we choose to focus on is water, irrigation, and rainfall. There's also substantial heterogeneity in TFP differences across India, as I tried to show you with the graphs on paddy and wheat. Okay, I want to now leave productivity aside, and well, maybe I should pause before I leave productivity aside and move on to prices, and to ask if there are questions. How am I doing on time, Tirtha?
Ma'am, it's 10:25 now. I am not sure how many slides. So you would...
When would you like me? No, so it's endogenous, right? So I'll cut short where I need to cut short.
No, so your session 11 is when we would want to...
But you don't have a special discussion
yeah, so we were hoping you would finish 10 minutes before, so
sure.
that...
Okay, yeah, that's fine. So just give me sort of a notice when 15 minutes before. I mean, sure. 15 to 11, so that I know that I have to wrap up in 5 minutes.
Sure.
So no questions so far? Okay. So I want to now move to the price part of it, right? Because this is the second key component into determining what's happening to farmer incomes. Are they getting, Tirtha mentioned they're getting low prices. So obviously incomes are not going to grow very quickly. I focused on the productivity part of it. Now I want to focus on the prices part. So just to remind ourselves that prices actually serve many functions. In terms of farmers' decisions, they serve as a signal for investments in productivity, to say, well, what crops should I be planting, etc., etc. And apart from the prices role in directly influencing incomes, of course, they have implications for higher incomes, generating multiplier effects through productivity increases, because higher prices mean that they're investing more, investments mean that productivity will increase. So there can in fact be an entire set of multiplier effects that improve productivity incomes and thereby reduce poverty. So they're both forward and linkages. Forward linkages going to, up in the value chain, backward linkages in terms of, demand for tractor repair services, etc., etc. The problem, however, is that if you just talk about higher agricultural prices, unless you create an artificial wedge, which is what we do through the PDS, higher agricultural prices also mean higher prices of food. Sorry. Also mean higher prices of food, and that, of course, will erode purchasing power. Now, from the farmer's perspective, what are the kinds of things that the farmer can do in terms of the harvest has happened? What can the farmer do where can the farmer sell the produce? So there are a large number of channels that are available to a farmer. The farmer can sell in some sense at a farm gate. They can sell to an input dealer. They can sell via contract farming. They can do a direct sale to a miller or a processor or a trader. And what I'm going to focus on, in all of these channels happen in India already to varying degrees. What I'm going to focus on is the sale at a regulated, what we in North India call a mandi or a market, where it is governed by the Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee, the rules of that APMC, where the sales are by auction. Okay, so I'll take a little detour through auctions and then come back. And the criticism of saying that you must sell at a regulated market is that there are barriers to entry in being able to sell at these sell and buy at these regulated markets, and so you need these market reforms to expand the choice set to farmers. Okay, so this is too restrictive, certainly for farmers and also for buyers. So one thing that happens in these regulated markets are that produce is supposed to be sold via an auction. Okay. Now the second price auction, which is what happens in many markets, not all, but in many markets. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to sort of review auction theory, but the idea is that auctions are efficient in the sense that the grain is sold to the buyer with the highest valuation, and it also implies that the larger the number of buyers, i.e. the higher the competition, the larger the price or higher the price that the farmer gets, and therefore the better his or her income. Now, auctions don't preclude the possibility of collusion, and there is a lot of literature. I suspect some of this will be covered by Ritika in her talk. But nonetheless, these are considered to be important tools by which to address collusion, especially if you have an MSP that is credibly enforced. And just to remind ourselves about how an English or a second price auction works, let's say there are 5 potential buyers in this particular market, and there is a reserve price, and they each have these valuations, and we call them independent private valuations or IPVs. So this is all we know is that they come from a common distribution, which is known, but what your valuation is, I don't know, you don't know what is my valuation, etc., etc. So let's say there's a reserve price, and very often it can just be the MSP, especially if it is credible. Then it's what the English ascending price auction says is that the auctioneer will start at the reserve price and keep increasing the price. Now, automatically, you know that this particular buyer whose valuation is below the reserve price is out, right? Because this buyer is not even making the reserve price, and there are effectively only 4 that are participating in the auction. So as the price increases, this person, this buyer who has this valuation or this price, is willing to pay this much. The minute the auctioneer raises the price just an epsilon beyond this buyer will drop out, because this is now said, this is not worth it for me, I can't afford this grain at this price. And similarly, the auction will proceed because there are still more people who are willing to pay a higher price for this lot of grain. And notice that it's when you get to when the auction goes beyond just the second highest buyer's valuation, the auction will stop, because at this point, the 4 or 3 remaining buyers will drop out. The only person who's left is this person who has this valuation here. So this buyer will win this grain, but will pay basically an amount close to the second highest price, which is why it's called a second price auction. So that was my attempt at a very quick introduction to what second price auctions do and why I think it's important. So the notion here in terms of farm laws are what is happening within a market and what is happening across markets. So the idea of the reforms of the farm laws was that it would increase choices for farmers, and that will mean that there is higher competition. With higher competition, you'll have better prices for farmers. However, the question is whether that will actually happen or not, because you need to see whether there is in fact an alternative place outside the regulated market that the farmer can go and sell his or her produce at. So I want to just set up a very basic thought experiment to understand this, which is to say that, let's say the farmer can choose to sell at the farm gate. Some buyer will come. There's only one potential buyer who comes to my village, does a bargain with me, and we settle on a price P0, and the distance is about D0. So when I'm talking about distance, I'm talking about basically transaction costs. Excuse me. The other alternative the farmer has is to go to this distance D1, where there's a regulated auction market at distance D1, where there's potential 10 buyers, and the prevailing price in this market is P1, which is presumably higher than P0. Alternatively, the farmer could choose to go to auction market D2, which is a little distant away, where the potential buyers are 100, so many more potential buyers in this market relative to in the second market relative to the first market. And therefore, the price prevailing here is P2, which presumably is higher than P1. Now, whether the farmer chooses to go to auction market 2, auction market 1, or auction market, or to sell at the farm gate, depends on these distance costs, right? So the difference in prices across market 2 and market 1, excuse me, is not going to cover the increased costs of getting the grain to the second market. The farmer may well choose to just go to the to market 1. Okay, so I mean, just a simple setup. Excuse me. Now let's say that there's deregulation, and there's farmers, buyers can set up shop anyway. They don't have to necessarily go to these auction markets. And so a bunch of buyers decide to leave this auction market and set up a private market at distance D3, where these two potential buyers were there already, and then these 3 buyers came from this auction market 1 and joined these 2 buyers, and there are now 5 buyers in this private market D3 private market, which is at distance D3. So the question is, where will the farmer go? Because what is happening now is that here there's going to be a depressing effect on prices. So prices will be lower here. It's not clear whether what prices will be in this setup, because is it some bargaining or is it a auction that the private market chooses to employ? We don't know that, because in regulated markets, we know that they are supposed to, at least in theory, employ an auction. So it's not very clear that if the choice for the farmer is between the auction market 1 and this private market here, whether the availability of an additional choice, but with less competition, is actually going to benefit the farmer, given that in this case, competition has reduced to the extent of 3 buyers. Now, this is a short-run picture. This is not a long-run picture, but it nonetheless is a simple enough characterization of how this would work to tell us that in the short run, it's not clear that prices will go up just because another market has been set up. If lots of such markets are set up, of course, that will happen, because you saturate the area with markets lowering transaction costs. ceteris paribus, that should in fact have an improvement in prices. But that's with constant demand. Now the question is, in the short term, is this going to happen or not? So, one reason I might be resistant is to say that, look, I may in the short run actually have lower prices than I was getting. Okay? Simply because of this lower competition here and not very clear how prices are getting determined in this at this private market. Okay? So now let's just superimpose
We
a minimum support.
We have a question.
Oh.
So will the decision, Shrimanjari, student here at CDS, she asks, will the decision of the farmer depend not only on the distance, but also number of buyers?
On prices, the farmer doesn't care how many prices there are, right? The only reason I'm bringing in the buyers is the idea is that higher the competition, higher the price. That's what we know auctions will tell us.
So she's asking that basically what you said was the transportation cost, right? The farmer used to go. But then what she wants to know is that will the number of buyers in that market, private market, also have a role on the prices which farmers get?
So
or the
two things,
decision?
right? Yeah. So absolutely. Now the point is that if, let's say, all 10 come here, okay, all 10 come here, not just 3, but all 10 come here, and this private market says, hey, I think this auctions is a good way to buy, and they also introduce auction as a method of sale, then obviously the farmer is better off, right? Because it has lower transaction costs, and you have the same number of all these buyers have come here, and there is an auction. But what I'm trying to say is that it's not it's not necessarily clear in the short run this is what will happen, because it could be that there are only 2 people here, and they're bargaining with the farmer. A couple more have joined them. Are they bargaining? Are they sort of doing this by auction? We don't know, because private markets are not mandated to have auctions as the mechanism, although many of the larger private companies do use it. And this is by way of a thought experiment. I don't know if that answers Shrimanjari's question. It's my point is it's an empirical question. Conceptually, it can go either way, at least in the short run, because you're trading off competition across space. In other words, this addition of a new market versus competition within a particular market. Competition here has reduced.
Please continue. I think, okay. Yeah.
Right. Right. Now, how does the MSP kind of come into all of this? The idea is that the MSP was meant to be a floor price. Okay, so when the MSP was started to be announced in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a distinction between what was called a minimum support price, and the idea was that agricultural markets generally in the short run have fairly inelastic supply functions. And so if you have a technological change going from period 1 to period 2, absent any intervention, because these are inelastic, you're going to see a drop in prices. If there is a drop in prices, the farmers are saying this is not a profitable crop. They're not going to invest in capital or in improvements associated with this crop, resulting in period 3 for the supply function to shift. I mean, this is hypothetical, obviously, to shift leftwards, which means that they're going to get, the prices will go up. So this is sort of called a cobweb effect by looking at a series of short-run supply functions. So the idea was that in this case, remember that technological change, to the extent that we're saying technological change allowed the supply function to shift out in period 2, the farmers are actually worse off, right? Because they're actually getting much lower prices in this as a consequence of technological change, because there's a supply shock. And what the MSP was meant to do was to say, okay, we recognize that. I realize I've changed the slopes of the supply functions here a bit, but that doesn't matter. That even if, when you adopt this new technology, when you invest on your farm, even if the supply function shifts out, we know that prices are likely to drop, but you know what? We'll guarantee this minimum support price so that at least you recover your costs of production. You're not losing, and maybe you will actually make some income. But what has happened over the years is that there is no difference between a procurement price, which is the price at which the government procures from farmers, and the support price, which was actually meant as a sort of cushion against declining prices. So this wedge has disappeared, leading to the kinds of crises that we are seeing. I'm going to skip all this and just give you a couple of examples, empirical examples. This is work by Avinash Kishore and his colleagues. In light of all of this, since we're focusing on the prices, so what happened when Bihar abolished the APMC Act in 2005? What happened to farmer prices? What happened to retail prices, wholesale prices? They looked at this in relative to other states by looking as a comparator, other states which did not repeal the APMC Act. In other words, APMC Act says that you have to sell at a regulated mandi. When you abolish that, you can sell wherever you want. So they find that actually there was no impact on wholesale prices of pulses and cereals as a consequence of the APMC. Remember, the farm laws are not new. Individual states have been doing this for a while. What about on margins between wholesale, retail, and farm gate wholesale? Again, they find that there is no crop. They actually found that where competition increased was the only example they found is with maize. They actually found substantial benefits had accrued to farmers, and the question unanswered is why maize, why not other crops? Maize was not such a, it's sort of a boutique kind of a crop which saw substantial benefits from the repeal of the APMC, but by and large, for a majority of the cereals and pulses, they did not find any impact. I'm also going to skip the second example and say, okay, let's go back to this original question of what is happening to the farmer incomes. Is it getting driven by technological change, in which case you should expect to see a reduction in costs of cultivation and production, or is it getting driven by prices? So I'm going to just show you the results for wheat and tell you that this also is true for paddy. To see that in the early 80s, early to late 80s, farm business incomes were growing at 3.0. Of course, in the most recent period, they've declined. This is a time when, in fact, yields were going up. Okay, because yields were going up, costs per unit quintal or output were going down. Because costs weren't changing. So you have a reduction in costs of production. Prices, farm harvest prices means open market prices are declining. MSP is declining. So this is a period of low and declining, whether low or not, they're declining prices, both the open market MSP. But because costs were also declining, coming out of an increase in productivity, farm business income was growing. And these are just rates of growth. I have nothing to say about the level of the income. Fast forward to the late 2000s, etc. What you find is some modest improvements in yields of less than 1% per year, some reduction in cost per quintal as well because of this increased yields, some reduction in cost per quintal, phenomenal drop in prices. MSP is also decreasing. Taken together, you find that farm business incomes are declining. So farm business incomes are declining despite modest improvement in productivity. However, the takeaway from this is that our own experience tells us that if you have phenomenal growth in productivity, at this point not measured, I mean, I've been talking about total factor productivity, this is just land productivity. The yields per hectare is a measure of land productivity. When you have substantial growth in productivity, be it of land or be it of total factor productivity, farmer incomes can be sustained despite adverse market conditions. That's the, you know, the classic example is prices of computing have come down because of technology, right? Nobody is saying that the manufacturers of these things are suffering losses because they are facing declining prices. Why isn't that happening? Because of technological change. And I want to kind of draw the same parallel here, that yes, it is indeed declining prices that are responsible for this crisis, but what we are not doing is paying enough attention to the productivity side of the story. So far, I want to kind of tie this back together and talk about challenges ahead in the next 2-3 minutes, if Tirtha will permit me. The structural transformation and productivity, there's sort of a strand of literature that looks at induced innovation, where the idea is that technical change, the induced technical change, will happen towards the factor which is scarce. Okay? So you'll try and augment land as a scarce commodity, you'll try and augment land productivity. And that's indeed what we have been doing so far. So if you look at fragmentation, we know this, there has been continuous land fragmentation. This is the number of marginal operational holdings that has seen a steady increase over time. So our focus on land improvement technology was natural. That's really what the Green Revolution was all about. It improved yields. What are yields? Yields are just land productivity. However, going forward, we need to worry about water. In other words, not more crop per unit land area, but more crop per drop of water. The problem is that water is a depleting resource. It's also the predominant source of irrigation, and it is an adaptation strategy for climate change. And water is not only depleting, it's getting increasingly uncertain resource under climate change. There have been some attempts to experiment with policy changes around pricing of water to see if this will arrest the rate of decline in groundwater resources and encourage sustainable use of water. The evidence so far based on an experiment in Gujarat as well as in Punjab. In Punjab, the thing is called Pani Bachao Paise Kamao, where because they figured that farmers are not going to be very keen on putting meters on their electricity connections, which will translate into volumetric pricing. They decided to say, we'll give you rebates, we'll give you a certain entitlement, and if you use below that entitlement, in your next bill, we'll give you a rebate on your electricity, which is the same thing as volumetric pricing, except flipped over. They did this mainly to ensure that there would be compliance on the part of farmers, and the literature so far seems to suggest that that is not really working out. I'm not going to talk about climate change because I suspect Professor Kavi Kumar is going to talk about this. And just conclude by saying that I think far too much of the debate, this is now my take, okay, so these are my sort of interpretation of not only my own work, but also the research that I've read around this area, is that far too much of the debate has focused on the prices and not enough on why it is that productivity isn't, we're not seeing the kind of dramatic changes in productivity, whether it's total factor productivity, land productivity, or water productivity that we did see 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And that we need to account for climate change. So there, technology does exist, seeds do exist, which allow for drought resistance and flood tolerance as characteristics, in addition to higher yields. And thereby, we need to reverse the stagnating trend in agricultural research. In terms of how much we spend on agricultural research, we fare very poorly in comparison with other Asian countries. And if you look at the agricultural budget for the recent year, about 80% or 85% of it, depending on how you calculate it, goes into crop insurance, goes into the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, which is a crop insurance, and the cash transfers. And there is very little left for agricultural research. In fact, I think over time, the research budget has in fact come down in agriculture. And given that it can play a crucial role in improving farmer incomes, it's an aspect that continues to be neglected. So I'll stop there. I probably have gone 5 minutes over time, but I'm happy to take questions.
Sure. No, it is 10:50 now, but you started 5 minutes late, so I thought you have that bandwidth. Yeah. So yeah, I thank you, Professor Meenakshi. It was a very, very enlightening lecture. You started with structural transformation, rural structural transformation. Then you moved on to say rural does not mean only agriculture and vice versa. Then we moved on to TFP, understanding what TFP is, how is it changing over the years, especially for cereals, and then prices, auction theory, MSP, APMC acts. So and finally bit of water and climate change. I'm sure students have learned a lot from it. So I welcome students if you have any questions. I'm sure there is one I can see in the chat box. Maybe I'll start with that and then students can ask. So Ranjana Roy, she's asking, how is farm business income measured? I think it is for the last bit of your exercise that you showed after MSP and market. Is it the difference between revenue and cost per hectare from the cost of cultivation data?
Yeah, basically that's correct. I mean, the point is, how do you account for unpaid resources such as land and owned land or family labor? All that has been taken into account. I mean, whether the imputation is correct or wrong is a separate question. But these costs include costs of family labor and rental value of owned land, etc. And it is from the cost of cultivation service. Yeah, it's like a net profit.
Anybody else? Questions?
Hello, ma'am. Can I ask?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Good morning, ma'am. I am Paramasivam. I have one doubt. Can I ask?
Sure,
Yes, of
please
course.
go ahead.
Yeah. So, ma'am, what would happen if the government withdraw the MSP? How it affect the market price mechanism?
So I think the question is whether the MSP is right now above what the market will bear or below what the market will bear, right? One of the set of slides that I did not show you is that the MSP, despite sort of hogging the space in newspapers, is not widely implemented in India, and some of Niti Aayog's own work suggests that. Having said that, and maybe Ritika will refer to this because this is her work with Sudha Narayanan that I'm referring to. What this body of research says is that the MSP acts as a signal to say that, so that if a private buyer comes to me and says that, look, I'm going to offer this much for you, you have a reference point to say that, look, I know the government has said it's this much. You can't sort of bargain me down to the level that you think you are going to say. So it has a role in. So their argument is that I think it has an anchoring role. The question is, in a state like Punjab, would prices fall, especially for paddy, if MSP was removed? I think the answer is yes, because there is virtually no private trade in paddy in Punjab, which used to be there even 20-25 years ago. Those have gone out of business altogether. So the answer is context specific. Whether it'll, in many states, I think MSP is irrelevant because all the open market prices are higher anyway. So it makes no difference to them because they're selling at the higher market price. But whether it has an additional role as a signaling effect or what we in economics refer to as anchoring effect, as a focal point, I think some research suggests that function may also be played by the MSP, although that was not the original intent. It was meant to be a
Okay.
signal. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, ma'am, for that lecture. My question is regarding the imbalance in fertilizer consumption in India. So basically, the favorable NPK ratio is 4, 2, and 1. But your paper and Gunwant Desai's paper suggested that the imbalances in fertilizer use have been affected the agriculture productivity way back in 1990s by quoting the Punjab's case. So that was because of this overuse of nitrogenous fertilizers. And the pricing policy of this fertilizers in India has been suggested. I mean, it shows that the nitrogenous fertilizers have been highly subsidized, so that the consumption of this N fertilizers were very high. So I was looking at the data, and as of 2020, the ratio in India as a whole shows that it is 7.3, 2.9, and 1. So there is a imbalance in fertilizer consumption as such. So the state case is very different. I mean, the Punjab's case is it's 34, 8, and 1. Haryana, it is 28, 8, and 1. So what is your take on this this fertilizer imbalance and productivity of agriculture as such?
Yeah, that will require a fairly long answer. I think the fact is, so I think you yourself said it, that you need to look at state-specific differences. If you look at the country as a whole, our average fertilizer consumption is way below world standards. Okay? And that continues to be true. So I don't think you can look at imbalance independently of the level. So, but having said that, does it mean that Punjab is not overusing? Of course they are. But it is, so as you said, this is you do need to look at this at a disaggregated level. The use in terms of optimal use is biologically determined. The use as farmers choose to apply them is determined by relative costs and returns of the individual fertilizers. And so I don't think there is enough. In fact, I had a slide which I took out because I knew I was running out of time, on a whole bunch of research agendas that can be formulated around this. It's not as if farmers don't know what the right balance is. Right? It's not as if they're unaware about what suits their land. After all, that was the purpose of the soil health card, is to actually empower them with more information. But whether the pricing can be altered in a sort of regional specific manner, I think that's a very difficult question to answer, right? Because if you subsidize it for me but not for my neighboring state, then they're just going to come and that'll just open up channels for me to take arbitrage opportunities, right? So without, I think that's all I'm going to say. I think the question of imbalance, 2 points. The question of imbalance cannot be treated independently of the level of overall use. And for India as a whole, we do not overuse fertilizer. It is in certain parts of India that we use too much fertilizer, and that biological sort of optimal ratios are not the same as farmer optimal ratios, and we need to have a better understanding of the latter.
Next, any question? I will ask one question,
Sure.
if that is okay. Yeah. This is about TFP, measuring TFP. So we all know that TFP could capture so many things, right? And you yourself had put that in detail on, and there are so many measures to measure relative TFP, such that the moment we as researchers start measuring TFP, we have more questions than solutions. We have more doubts. So, so what would you think would be the best measure? This is for students also, if anybody is using TFP measure, etc., etc. So what do you suggest would be the best measure, say for to measure agriculture? Would be to use something like a Thornquill index, or what would be, or one should go for a data envelopment measure, or something like that? What would be your suggestion?
So I think the first thing is that the choice of metric or choice of methodology depends on the question you're asking. If I wanted a DA, I'm looking at a frontier. and I have specific focus on whether farmers or firms can be moved closer to the frontier without changing input use. That's not the question I was asking right now. And so, those metrics could come there, but you could also use different, different econometric methodologies, not just non-parametric methodologies to answer that. So I think the point number one is that what method you use. So if I want to compare what I did with TFP growth in terms of, say, I want to compare India with Bangladesh, there's nothing else I can do. Because if there are missing inputs here, there are missing inputs there also. So it's not as if it doesn't have a utility in making comparisons over time or making comparisons across, different geographies, et cetera, provided the same methodology. And since the one I presented here coming from national accounts, and these are reasonably, uniformly done across countries, that's perfectly appropriate. And having said that, then the second point is, no matter what you say, every methodology comes with limitations. You need to recognize that there are limitations and see what, do robustness checks to see how sensitive your results are. I don't think there is a one size fits all. I personally find the DEA very restrictive in some of the assumptions that it makes, but it has uses because it's a neat way of computing technical efficiency separately from technical change.
Right. Because students here also, they are, for their thesis and other research, they are using different measures of TFP. I'm sure your response would have helped all of them. They use stochastic frontier, DA. There are so many methods for efficiency and TFP, etc. Anybody else? Any questions?
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah.
In your presentation, you are presenting that output increases, but the income of the farmer is decreases. And the thing is that, we can see that more or less prices of the products are agricultural products are increasing gradually, and also government also giving subsidies and for protecting farmers, there is MSP policy. And after 1991 also LPG policy was implemented, and more or less also food products are exporting other countries. So these are things are happening in the in India, but still we can see that income of the farmers are decreasing. So in that case, what we can do, like what kind of policy we can suggest for farmers income increase?
Yeah, so I think I just want to say that MSP has been here since 1967, not 1990s. MSP has been there from the 60s. It came hand in hand with the Green Revolution. So I want to correct any misconception that MSP is a post-reform, post-1991 phenomenon. It's not. It's been there since the 1960s.
No, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am. Actually, I told after 1991, the LPG policy was formed. Like the people are exporting food products to other countries.
So remember that as far as wheat and rice are concerned, we do switch off exports. If we feel that prices are going up or there is productivity shock, it's not as if there are exports, then that doesn't mean that they will be allowed to export next year. Secondly, our exports are in niche commodities, right? So if you look at something like wheat and rice, what percentage of wheat and rice that is produced is getting exported? It's very small. It's extremely small. It may be high value, but in terms of tonnage, it's extremely small. So you're looking at tea, you're looking at leather. I mean, it's not as if there aren't, but in a livelihood sense, I don't think that comes from a very large base. So I'm not sure if I've got the gist of your question, but I can only reiterate that if one of the sort of resolutions, for the lack of a better word, is that you need to make the high value growth that accounts for the increased productivity from those sectors may be more broad based. That's a very simple statement, but how do you actually implemented. And the second point is that where you are in sectors which support a large share of rural livelihoods, the emphasis pendulum needs to shift back to some research investments as well, because we know we have seeds which can resist drought. We know we have seeds which can resist floods. These are technologies being developed by overseas. We should be doing this kind of investment and research ourselves, so that those are also mechanisms to protect farmers from downside price risk, or at least income risk, if not price risk. Price, in fact, will go up if there's a supply shortage. I have a feeling I haven't answered your question, but that's the best I can do.
No, anyway. Okay. I think it is 11:07 now. We have another session in 20 minutes, and that would be a hybrid session. So people have to come here, so they would need more time. So thank you, Professor Meenakshi, for your lecture. It was very, very helpful. I'm sure students gained a lot from it, starting from concepts to empirical applications to understanding the concept and things like that, and using data and understanding the broader agricultural context of prices, where do they come from, MSP auction, etc., etc. So I would once again thank you very much for being a part of our lecture series, and we are very grateful to you for agreeing to be a part of it. And thank you once again.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now it is for participants who all are here. Please come to John Robinson room. This will be an in-person lecture, and we'll have tea before that. So you can all please come here. And rest of all, we will all meet again at 11:30. We'll start our next session at 11:30. Thank you. Hi, am I audible? Hi.
Professor, you're audible.
Yeah, so we'll start in 5 minutes, okay? 11:35. It started raining here, so give us 5 minutes. We'll start. Please be patient. Okay? Am I audible now? This is for the online participants, please.
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Thank you. So welcome back once again.